Okay, so last time we were in class, we talked about square roots of variables. So today we're going to talk about taking the square root of numbers. This is just reviewing what a perfect square is. So we're going to write a list of squares that we know. So starting with the smallest perfect square, we have 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, and then 64, 81, and 100. So I want you to write that down somewhere on your paper while I finish talking about this. So basically, a perfect square means if I told you, give me the square root of 4, you could put those 4 boxes together and get a 2 by 2. So the square root of 4 is 2. Same thing with a 1 by 1. Okay, so the square root of 1 is simply 1. All right, so now we're going to talk about non-perfect squares. So 8 does not have a number that can be multiplied by itself to get 8. So basically this is just saying it's not a perfect square because 8 of these boxes cannot be formed together to get a perfect square. But 9 is a perfect square. We could fill in a box right here for the 9th box and get a 3 by 3. Okay, so we're going to talk about how can we simplify. That's the word. We're not finding a specific answer. We're just simplifying. Okay, so let's talk about that. What happens with a radicand is not a perfect square. Now this word right here we haven't talked about, but a radicand is just this number, the number in the radical. Okay, so we can pull out a perfect square of 4, which is a 2 by 2. Okay, which is what they've done here. And 4 times 2 gives us 8. So basically all you're doing is taking the largest perfect square that factors in to this number. So our largest perfect square that we could pull out here is 4. So you're basically saying the square root of 8 is the same thing as saying the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, which is what they've done down here. Okay, the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 2 doesn't simplify. Okay, so this little note down here, this is just to help you on your benchmark. It's talking about if your answer has a radical, which is the square root symbol that we talked about, it's called irrational. Okay, it's if your answer still has a radical. All right, so let's try 125. So basically these are the steps. You're going to take your number that's under the radical, your radicand, which here is 125, and you're going to write it as a product, which is multiplication, of the largest perfect square factor. So out of our list of numbers here that we wrote a minute ago, the largest number that goes into 125 is 25. Okay, so we would say the square root of 25 times the square root of 5. All right, the square root of 25 simplifies to 5. The square root of 5 does not simplify, so it stays in the radical. So your simplified form there would be irrational because it still contains the radical, and this would be your answer. Okay, so all you're doing is rewriting it as a multiplication sentence using the largest perfect square that is a factor of the number you were given. All right, so let's talk about why we have to use the largest perfect square. While I'm talking, you need to make sure that you write this down. This is the most important thing right here that you could write down today. You need to know it has to be the largest perfect square factor. The reason why is because just like with 32, okay, the perfect square that they pulled out was 4, but you could also pull 4 out from 8. So that would be redundant here because you would have to do a completely another step. Okay, so let's look at this. If they pulled out 16, 16 is a perfect square and it's larger than 4. So all they did was rewrite this as the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. The square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of 2 does not simplify, so you leave it as 4 square root of 2. Okay, so it's just like if you had 12 over 6 when we're simplifying fractions. We all know that the answer to that is 2, but if you divide both these numbers by 2, because they're both divisible by 2, you would get 6 over 3, which is still 2, but you had this extra step. Okay, so that's what they did here. They simplified, but 8 can still be simplified, so they had to simplify again. Okay, they got the same answers, but this one has an extra step, whereas this one you were able to solve with just one step. So if you pull out the largest perfect square factor, you have less work, and every single one of y'all are lazy, so you know you want less work. All right, so let's talk about the square root of 48. Now, this is what they did. They didn't know what perfect square went into 48, so they did all this factoring. Okay? When you factor, you would have gotten this 2 times this 2 times this 2 times this 2 times 3 equals 48. Okay, but 2 is not a perfect square, and 3 is not a perfect square. So we need to figure out what number goes into 48 that is a perfect square. Okay, 2 times 2 is 4. 4 is a perfect square, but 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times 2 is 16. 16 is larger than 4, so we need to pull out 16. So you'd have the square root of 16 times the square root of 3 equals the square root of 48. And then all you do is simplify. The square root of 16 is 4. There is no square root to simplify for 3. So your answer here would be 4 square root of 3. All right. If this makes sense to you, if factoring makes sense, I'm fine with you doing factoring. If writing it out like this doesn't make sense, but this does, you work it the way it makes sense. As long as you get the correct answer, I don't care how you work it. A lot of people like to work it, especially on A days. This is how my kids wanted to work it on A days. They pulled out their factor tree, but with the largest perfect square, which was 16. Instead of pulling out all of these, they pulled this out and said, well, this is 4, and this is the square root of 3. So either way you want to do it is fine with me. All right. If the sub will please pause the video and let them work these 4 problems on their own, and then if you'll hit play again, then we can go over the answers. Okay, so after you've worked these on your own, these are the answers that you should get. 72. A lot of people want to say 8 and 9, but you would have to go back and simplify 8. So it is 36. 36 times 2 is 72. All right. The square root of 36 is 6. There is no simplified version of the square root of 2. So your answer here would be 6 square root of 2. All right. Square root of 18. My 8A kids wanted to say 6 and 3, but 6 and 3 are not perfect squares. You must pull out the largest perfect square factor, not the largest regular factor, the largest perfect square factor. All right? So, it would be 9 and 2. So you have the square root of 18. The square root of 9 is 3. There is no simplified version of the square root of 2. So your answer here is 3 square root of 2. All right, so then for 360, a lot of people looked at this and said, I don't know how to do this, so I'm not going to do it. Stop being lazy. 360 divided by 36 is 10. 36 is the largest perfect square that goes into 360. So you should have the square root of 36 times the square root of 10. All right, the square root of 36 is 6. There is no simplified version of the square root of 10. So your answer should be the square root of 10. Okay, 6 square root of 10 should be your final answer. All right, and last one, looking at 24. A lot of people yesterday said 8 and 3, but 8 and 3 are not perfect squares. However, you can pull out the square root of 4 and the square root of 6. The square root of 4 is 2. There is no simplified version of the square root of 6. So you're done. 2 square root of 6. All right. If you have questions at this point, you need to pause and you need to write them somewhere on a sheet of paper so when I come back on Thursday, we can talk about it. Please make sure you rewind if you are lost. Okay, so we're going to simplify the square root of 28. I want you to try to work this on your own. Pause your video if you need to. If you break this down, you should get the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. The square root of 4 is 2. There is no simplified square root of 7. So your answer here is A. All right. Then we're going to move on. I'm going to give y'all a couple problems on a worksheet. The sub will give it to you. So let's talk about simplest radical form. Okay, so this is just taking it one extra step. All right, so this is talking about if you have a coefficient, which is the big number in front of the radical, we're wanting to know how we can simplify that. So basically, you leave the 2 alone for now. All right, and then you do the same process we were just doing. The largest perfect square that goes into 18 is 9. All right, so you would write that as 2 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. 9 times 2 is 18. Leave that 2 alone. All right, now the square root of 9 is 3. And this is where they got their answer. 2 times 3 is 6. And you leave the square root of 2 alone. All right, same thing for 7 square root of 12. A lot of people wanted to say 6 and 2 for 12, but 6 nor 2 are perfect squares. You have to pull out the largest perfect square. All right, and then bring down that 7. Okay, 7 times the square root of 4, which is 2. Leave the square root of 3 alone. And now our answer matches theirs. 7 times 2 is 14. Leave the square root of 3. It's just taking it one extra step. You just have one more number you have to multiply on the outside. All right, so let's try this one. I want you to work this one on your paper and see what you get. Don't forget, just because this is negative does not mean this problem is harder than a regular problem. It just means that your coefficient on the outside is also going to be negative. Okay, so a lot of people wanted to say on 8A that the largest perfect square that goes into 48 was 4. However, that's not the case. If you pulled out 4, 9, and 16, 4 goes into 48, 9 does not, but 16 does. So the larger number there is 16. So you should get the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. Okay, and don't leave off your negative 3. All right, so then you have negative 3 times the square root of 16, which is 4, times the square root of 3. And negative 3 times positive 4 is negative 12. And then you have the square root of 3. This is your answer. You work it the exact same way, except your coefficient is now negative. You will not get a negative under this radical, so if you ever get a negative under there, you worked it wrong. The negative stays on the outside. All right. You'll have a couple practice problems on your worksheet that your sub is going to give you. So let's do a problem like this. This is going to be a type of problem that will be on your benchmark. I probably won't give you a problem like this on your test, but if I do, I want you to know how to work it. Okay, so let's talk about first. A lot of people look at this and freak out and say, nope, it has a letter, I'm done. I'm not even going to try. But it's really, really easy. All you got to do is simplify like we were doing. Okay, so come down here and write out 5 times the square root of 20. Now I want you to think, what's the largest perfect square that goes into 20 out of the list that we have? Obviously, it has to be less than 20. Out of these three numbers, the only one that goes into 20 is 4. So you should have 5 times the square root of 4. 4 times 5 is 20. So times the square root of 5. We brought this down, and then 4 times 5 is 20. All right, so we bring this down again. The square root of 4 is 2. You cannot simplify the square root of 5. All right, 5 times 2 is 10. And you bring down the square root of 5. So if they gave you the square root of 5, what's the only other number that we have in our answer? 10. So your answer here would be B. Pause your video and write this down if you need to. All right, let's go to the next one. Same thing here. This is just like the problems that we did when we first started this lesson. We've actually worked the square root of 72 already in this video. So let's talk about why we don't break down 8 and 9. 9 is a perfect square, but you would have to go back and simplify 8 as well. You pick the largest, so that would be 36 and 2. All right, 2 doesn't have a perfect square, so you bring it down. The square root of 36 is 6. So if it gives you this up here, out of our answer, what is A? 6 or 2. So it would be 6. All right, pause your video and write this down if you need this one too. All right, 2 more and then we're done. Okay, so it's asking for which one is greater. Now 16 only factors to 2 and 13, and neither one of those are perfect squares. So we need to figure out another way that we can figure out which one is greater. There are 2 ways, so I want you to write this down as I'm working it. This is way 1, and this is way 2. That looks like a Z. My bad. Okay, so way 1, all you do is estimate the square root. Okay, so we know the square root of 25 is 5, and we know that the square root of 36 is 6. So the square root of 26 has to lie somewhere in between, probably closer to 5. Okay, so that would mean that 6 is greater. All right, way 2 is probably easier. All you have to do is square the whole number. All right, so if we have the square root of 26 and 6, we talked about how square roots and squares are inverses. Okay, so if we're working backwards, 6 times 6 is 36. The square root of 36 is 6. So which one is greater, the square root of 26 or the square root of 36? It would be this, and the square root of 36 is 6. So you still got the same answer, either way you do it. Pause your video and write it down if you need this. Alright, so let's try the last one without writing down our two separate ways. Okay, I'm not going to write out all the steps. We're just going to talk about it. If 10 squared is 100, is 84 less than or greater than 100? Obviously, it's less than. So then 10 here would be greater. Or you could have said, I know that the square root of 81 is 9, and the square root of 100 is 10. So the square root of 84 must lie in between 9 and 10, but closer to 9. Okay? So that would mean that 10 would have to be greater than the square root of 84. Okay, make sure that you write down any questions that you have for me. And finish this worksheet, turn it in the tray. And then your homework is in your packet that I gave you last time. Alright, ignore my little note. This was for Mr. Craig to fix our projector. Okay, your homework is just A through M right here. Alright, A through M. And it is due Thursday. If you come in my classroom without your homework, it is a 0. Do not worry about any of this. Okay? If you have time at the end of class, then you may do your classwork or your homework. Okay? Either one is fine. But please take your time watching the video. If you need to go back and watch it again, please do so. If you have questions, you may ask your sub. If she doesn't know, just star them and we'll talk about it when I come back. Please be on your best behavior. I don't want to get any bad notes. Don't forget, just like our little quote right here says, you're the person who decides what you're going to do. Have a good day.